Good morning and welcome. This is American Vineyard Live. Kent Daane, a distinguished professor and cooperative extension specialist in the Department of Environmental Science, Policy, and Management at the University of California, Berkeley, is joining us today to discuss vine mealybug and other vineyard pests we should be keeping an eye out for this summer. We're also joined this morning by Janine Larimore of Pacific Biocontrol, our title sponsor for this event. Thank you. Special thanks to Pacific Biocontrol for their support. Thank you both for joining us this morning. And thank you all as well for joining us from your various places. Just a couple of announcements. As usual on this webcast, there will be 2 prize winners announced at the end of the event. One lucky viewer will receive a brand new Baco pruning tool set, and the other a $100 Amazon gift card. And of course, we'd like to give a special shout out one more time to our sponsors, Baco Pruning Tools, supporting our giveaway this morning, and Pacific Biocontrol for making this event possible. Finally, last but not least, before we get into it, if you have any questions you'd like to ask our panelists this morning, you can text the number below at the bottom of this screen, and we'll do our best to answer as many of them as possible. Janine, let's start with you, shall we? Why don't you introduce yourself and give us a little background on your mission?
Sure. Well, hello, Janine. I'm Janine Larimore, and I'm the Northern California rep for Pacific Biocontrol. I reside in the lovely wine country of Lodi and been working with Pacific Biocontrol for about 10 years now. Our goal has always been to bring efficacious and economic products, pheromone products for baiting disruption to the market. And we've been working with Vine Mealybug probably since 2017, where we wanted to bring this product to market. We were seeing success with it over in Europe, and we thought it could be a good fit for California as well. We partnered with Kent Daane and his team for many years, doing numerous studies and looking at pheromones and how to make them the most economic. And we feel like we got to a good place. So it's great that we can see this product out in the market and see how it's impacting and helping growers.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And Kent,
Yes.
this is a good time to introduce yourself as well. Tell us a little bit about your career and what you love most about your work.
Yeah, my career. So actually, I think this is my 43rd year in Central Valley working on different insect pests. If I include that time as a graduate student working on pests of olive, I have mostly focused on biocontrol, but also mating disruption and other control tools. And it's been a blast. I've enjoyed almost all of it. Not only grapes, but almonds, stone fruit, olives. Even worked in lettuce for a while. I've seen a tremendous number of changes. And when you think about when I started, I think the University of California was a little bit different at that time too. So I arrived with this great group of people. Charlie Summers, Dick Rice, Walt Bentley, Jack Dibble, so many campus-based people like Jocelyn Miller, who identified so many of these pheromones. Ken Hagan, Leo Caltagirone, Don Dalston, my biocontrol colleagues. So it was different. It seemed like there was more of this team effort. And you'd think there would be competition with so many people, but there really wasn't. There was a lot of collaboration. So the group at Kearney welcomed me in. They started me off on some projects on stone fruit. And that later led to projects in almonds and in grapes. We were working with the variegated grape leafhopper. At one point in time, that was the number one pest of grapes in California. It was causing defoliation. It was a tremendous problem. And I worked with a UC Riverside group with a farm advisor named Don Flaherty, a fantastic crew. And we did importation of natural enemies from Colorado down to Mexico. And at that time, they were all called Anagris epos. And it took a taxonomist, Sergei Trapitsyn at Riverside, to determine that, no, it's a whole group of parasites. And then, like so many things happen, we found a new chemical, the neonicotinoid imidacloprid. We know it as Admire for vine mealybug, but as a foliar, it's Bravado. And that just completely devastated the leafhoppers.
Hmm.
So things change. As my time has gone forward, different pests, different programs, except for the vine mealybug. That's something that's just stayed with us for a long time.
We're so glad to have him, huh?
It.
Yeah. Well, you've had a rich career of research and work with our growers. It sounds like you may have already answered a little bit of this question, but what is your primary mission in your research efforts?
I actually have got this written down someplace because when I started, I was hired as a biocontrol specialist to try to control pests of perennial crops. And my initial job assessment was to support a group of biocontrol researchers on the Berkeley campus. I think between the IPM group and the biocontrol group, Marjorie Hoy, Steve Welter, I mentioned Ken Hagan, Leo Caltagirone, just many, many folks. There were probably 12 faculty on the campus that worked directly with insect pests in the Central Valley or Central Coast or Salinas area. And Davis had a number of people, and UC Riverside had a number of people. So really, my job was to help be the person in the valley to contact the growers, to help with natural enemy releases, efficacy of natural enemy releases. And the program changed over time, in part because as those folks in Berkeley retired, they were typically not replaced. And also the importance of biocontrol changed a little bit as well because of things like mating disruption, because of, remember, we didn't have very many systemic chemicals for these pests when I started. Everything was a contact. I still arrived here when people were using chlorpyrifos and Lorsban in season for mealybug controls, and you can't do that now. So there was a shift, and that meant a shift in my research. Navel orangeworm is a fantastic example. So when I started, we were working with a number of natural enemies of navel orangeworm, a pest of almonds, a pest of walnuts, a pest of pistachios. And we were actually pretty happy with some of their impact because at that time, growers were trying to get down to 2 or 3% damage. And so if these natural enemies were out there working and you were going from a level of 7-10% damage to 3 or 4% damage, that was success. Along came mating disruption. Along came the use of pyrethroids. And then people were thinking, we are going to eradicate this insect. And of course, it didn't happen, but my parasites can't operate at a 1% infestation rate. They just don't have a very good searching behavior. In fact, the most common parasites of navel orangeworm, the two that we think of all the time are this bathylid wasp, Goniosis legneri, named for Fred Legner, UC Riverside professor, long retired, and Copidosoma. It used to be Pentaletomastix, then changed to Copidosoma, then Copidosomopsis plethorica. And both of those use a biology to maximize the resource of one navel orangeworm. Goniosis puts many eggs on the navel orangeworm. Copidosoma puts one egg inside the navel orangeworm egg, and then like you can have twins, it has 360 twins. So it just waits, waits, and waits until, in fact, it causes the navel to eat more. We actually think it has a 16 star because it's prepped by this parasitoid to get larger. And when it gets to that final larval stage, then this polygerm, which is what the parasite egg becomes, divides and divides and divides and divides until you've got over 200, 300 parasites come out of one. So they maximize the use of that one host they find. They're not good at finding those low densities.
So you almost need a fair number for
You
that.
need a lot of navel orangeworm for them to work well.
Mm,
Yeah, which goes against what we want.
creates a little bit of a dilemma. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, it's kind of funny that you mentioned that. What have been some of your favorite pests to study in
Um,
your time?
so we're known for mealybugs, and uh, if I've got if I've had any success, it's in great part due to Glenn Yakota, who was the lab manager for almost 30 years. And Glenn and I have talked about this, and we do not like working on mealybugs. Um, you have to strip bark. You have to crawl underneath vines. There's really no shade above vineyards for a long sample day. Oftentimes, it's fairly dusty within the vineyard blocks. And we almost always preferred working on some of the moth pests, the lepidopteran pests, especially in stone fruit. Um, they were easier to see. You could see the damage of a peach twig borer at the top of the tree from the bottom of the tree.
Mhm.
So the survey, the sampling was so much easier. The parasitoids were always quite interesting, very pretty insects to work with, very easy to rear out, very easy to identify compared to the mealybug natural enemies. Um, so yeah, I liked working on the moth pests more so than the mealybugs.
Mhm. And as I understand it, as we discussed earlier, you won't necessarily be working with those things much longer, correct?
I am going to retire June 2026, so less than a year now. Again, I've had over 40 years service credit, so I will be losing money by continuing to work. I can go emeritus and contribute, but it would be nice to escape all the paperwork. It would be nice to, focus on projects I really want to work on,
Mhm.
and be able to do more foreign exploration on insect pests that I think I can make a difference on.
Well, thank you for the broad impact that you've had on the
Oh,
industry
thank you.
for the 40 plus years you've been with us. Thank
Thanks.
you. Well, speaking of broad impact, let's talk a little bit. Let's get right into Vine Mealybug, shall we? So we talked a little bit in the pre-interview about some of the pests that our growers should be keeping an eye out for this summer. You mentioned a few. What have you noticed any unusual pressure from one or two pests in more recent years?
Well, for me, what I mentioned to you before is that um, glassy wing sharpshooter has always been a Southern California problem. Uh, Down in Bakersfield, there was a program called the General Beal Project that was a joint effort between the UC and CDFA and USDA. Uh, and you should interview David Haviland about the success of that project because for a long time they really stopped glassy wing sharpshooter from moving northward. It was a tremendous pest of wine grapes vectoring Pierce's disease down south. Um, and I just rarely saw glassy wing sharpshooter in the Fresno area, in the Madera area. And now I've seen glassy wing sharpshooter in at the station at Kearney. I've seen glassy wing sharpshooter in some commercial vineyards. And just last week, a neighbor brought me an insect. What is this thing? We found it on our peaches. I said, well, it's glassy wing sharpshooter. So I think it is becoming a little bit more prevalent right now. And of course, the invasive pests we have to worry about.
Sorry, Kent. My team is telling me we need a little bit more mic.
I got it.
Just gonna point that up in your
I,
direction.
I'm looking at towards you. I should
There we
be
go.
doing it
There
this
we go.
way.
Perfect.
And so I think too that an invasive pest we need to be on the lookout for is spotted lanternfly. That could be very, very devastating. My understanding is that it really damaged vines in Japan. My understanding also is that one good aspect is that it's been fairly easy to kill with chemicals.
Hmm.
But like all insects, resistance can be a problem in the future.
Yeah. So, well, you mentioned spotted lanternfly. Are we seeing pressure in California from spotted
No,
lanternfly yet?
no.
Okay. So it's just the doomsday premonition, right? That
It's
we're worried
keep
about. Yeah.
keep on a lookout for it
Yeah.
because
Hmm.
think of all the insect pests that um, were found, and then we did surveys, and CDFA decided that because of the results of the survey, we've identified the olive scilla, as an example, as being too widespread to eradicate. So If you're going to eradicate one of these insects, you've got to do it in the very beginning when the
Mm,
population is small and it's localized and you can concentrate your efforts.
yeah. Well, how's the pressure been with Vine Mealybug so far this year that if you've been able to observe the last, well, I'll just say the last 3 years or so?
I think we've had consistent pressure of Vine Mealybug. I think that some of our products maybe are not working quite as well as they
Mm,
have in the past. I've always thought that the way that mealybug works is that it gets into the vineyards and growers don't know it's there for the first year or two. And then once they find it's a pest problem, they go into this annual routine of spraying insecticides. And there are a handful of insecticides that are very popular, that have always worked well, that are great at suppressing that pest, but nothing eradicates it. Nothing is 100%. So you are spraying your vineyard and it's moving in your vineyard. You're keeping the population down below what we would consider to be an explosive damaging population. You're probably keeping it out of the clusters, but now it's not on the north corner of your 100-acre block. It's on the north and northeast corner. And then 3 years later, it's on the northeast and south sections. And then eventually it's just throughout that entire block. Now, maybe that's not a problem, but maybe you are working and all of a sudden you get some of the leaf roll. Maybe you start to get some of the viruses, and now you're noticing vine decline. Well, that's all, both are vectored by mealybugs. So it's the combination of the mealybug's prevalence, the mealybug as a vector of pathogens, and getting that pathogen in after the mealybug comes, or the mealybug comes with a pathogen.
yeah, well, and I think that's a great segue into our next subject. How do we know that we have vine mealy? I mean, you mentioned that they're very difficult to find. They're one of your least favorite to study because of the challenge that it is to detect them. What are some early signs? Tell us a little bit
Let's
about how we
let's
can find it.
let's pretend I'm pounding on the table with vigor. You've got to, if you don't feel like you've got a mealybug pest problem, put out pheromone traps. The pheromone traps will find mealybugs before you can.
Mm,
You might see ants. Okay, ants are there. We probably should follow the ants. Probably will find mealybugs. You can look for honeydew on the trunk. You can look for leaves drop down to the ground. But if you've put out pheromone traps and you find, 2 or 3 males in August and September, maybe those males are coming from a neighbor's vineyard. Maybe they're being blown by the wind. But when you start saying 15, 20, 30, that mealybug is someplace in your vineyard.
mm.
And you should start looking. Maybe put out more traps and see if you can identify where it's being concentrated in the vineyard. But pheromone traps do work. Growers that are using mating disruption feel like, I'm using mating disruption. There's no use to put the pheromone traps out. And Ning can talk about their programs, but most people are not keeping mating disruption out there late in the season, September, October. So if you're trapping September, October, and you start to see mealybugs, that represents the population for next season.
Mhm.
And that gives you an idea of, well, this year I applied Movento and I'm seeing fewer. Last season I did not apply and I saw more at the end of the season. So you start to get a history that you can record based on data, and you can pair that with what your chemical program was.
So if we don't have pheromone traps out, we should.
I would,
Yeah. Okay. Well, and that's because it's such an important, or I should say, destructive pest
yes.
that no matter whether we think we have it or not, we need to be on guard.
And if you
Okay.
just don't feel like you wanna do it at the end of the season because, we're counting pheromone traps right now. We've got some new employees, and they're getting a little bit frustrated because we're getting a lot of zeros. There are a lot of zeros in June and July. It's hot. The males are fragile, they die. Um, but there's a population there. And so if you don't want to monitor all season long, certainly put pheromone traps out in August and September. and October.
So even if we're not detecting, let's say we do put out pheromone traps
Yeah.
today, if we're not detecting today, maybe we will in the fall when
Yeah.
it's cooler.
Yeah, in the fall is when you have the majority of the flight happening.
Okay.
Yeah.
Excellent.
And I'll just add to this, similar to what Kent has said, in my conversations with growers, they'll often say, "Oh, we don't have it." And so there's that coin phrase, well, if you don't have it, maybe you're just not looking hard enough. And certainly this is a pest that I have learned that is so much easier to prevent, right? Economically, right? If you can prevent it, pheromone or being aware that it's out there, the long-term economic benefit of the health of that vineyard far exceeds, what you're going to have. So putting traps out, right? I remember working in a vineyard that we just had started doing some trials in, and I couldn't visually see Vine Mealybug, but we'd have 100 males in the traps, right? And it was such an interesting new pest for me to work on. I was just shocked, right? So when I have conversations with people and they just don't feel they have that out there, put some traps out. Even like Ken said, put them out in September and just watch them during those last few months of the season. And you might be really surprised at what you pick up out there and in different locations of your vineyard too. So it's a really good key indicator of what might be out there that you just haven't noticed.
Before all these pheromone traps, I was working with the grape mealybug. Before the vine mealybug was in California. And I was told by some folks in Napa, it's not here. And I basically challenged anybody and I said, take me to any vineyard in Napa and I can find it. And you could.
Mhm.
The natural enemies were doing such a great job of keeping it at very low densities, but we knew that leaf roll was moving around. And we knew that that was the vector for leaf roll. So the mealybug had to be there.
Well, that said, our fall trapping should be indicating what we're doing in the next season. If we're seeing high populations,
Yeah.
what in August, September, like you said, when should we be focusing on control? What time of
So
the year?
if you're seeing really high populations in September, you're probably not going to be able to do much about that population that year. So now your focus, you're doing out pheromone traps. You've got a history. They've been fairly low. And then this year you look and you've got 200 per trap in September. A big jump, a big increase. So now you have to start considering the different options for controlling that pest for next season. Your first option at that time is probably a post-harvest insecticide application of something. Most growers might consider Movento as a post-harvest application. You're only allowed 12 ounces per year, so you have to figure out what you had put on previously.
Mhm.
The next window of opportunity might be a delayed dormant application of an insect growth regulator, buprofizine, a plod. That has a really good knockdown of that overwintering population. Doesn't last the whole season. Most popular is probably a around bloom or a little bit later application of Movento. That's kind of replaced our neonicotinoids, which are also very popular. Sometimes the neonics are going in before, sometimes after the Movento. There are now new restrictions on some of the neonicotinoids, so you can't use them repeatedly in the season. So you have to keep that in mind. Let's say you put on an application of Movento and you're still getting trap captures in June or July. You've got some mid to late season options. We used Savanto in a late June application and had pretty good knockdown. Other people have not reported as good of results with that product and reported much better results with the sale.
Hmm.
For me, both the sale and Savanto are great mid-season to late season materials. If you haven't applied a neonic early, one of the neonics you can apply mid-season is Belay. That's a possibility. So there are products that are still effective that you can still use, and you can use in combination if you are just monitoring with what's gone on already.
Well, we just got a question from the audience a moment ago through text. A question about the pheromone traps, if we could revert back to that real quickly before we move on too far. Might pheromone traps inadvertently bring mealybugs to your vineyard from neighboring properties? That's a valid concern.
They can bring the adult male mealybug, one of the most fragile animals on the planet.
Hmm.
They're not going to bring the females in. They're only going to bring the adult male in. They might bring in some parasitoids. They might get the parasite to be a little bit more active. So no, you're not going to. The adult female is pretty much sessile. The immature females, they're not attracted to the pheromone. So never in my career have I seen a female mealybug in a pheromone trap that I can remember.
So it's actually, to some degree, because it's going to attract the parasitoids, like you said, to some degree, it may actually be helpful to bring some males in to
Not
help
as
that population.
right.
Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, not as helpful as mating disruption.
Okay.
So our studies have not been very conclusive, but work in Israel has suggested for the citrus mealybug that putting out mating disruption increases parasitism levels because one of these parasitoids, an anagyrus, is attracted to the pheromone. So, I always made the story of the kid in the toy store that, he's very happy because he knows there's toys in there someplace. Same thing with the parasite.
Yeah, excellent. Well, actually, I think this is a great segue into talking a little bit more about mating disruption. Janine, did you have something to say on that?
Yeah, well, when we were talking about the trapping and Ken, when we did some work out in the field, as far as the pull that those pheromone lures have, it was always my understanding that there isn't that great of a range that it will pull the males in from. So depending on where that grower places their trap, right, they're not going to pull their neighbor's vine mealybug in. Or I know when people put pheromone mating disruption out, they're always concerned, right, that they're going to attract all their neighbors' insects, right? They're going to bring everybody else's problems into their block, and that's typically not how mating disruption work. Right, there might be an increase in male activity, not in the female activity. But yeah, we've also seen similar results in that it can increase the parasitoid behavior or an activity there because of that pheromone being out there.
What I would add to that is that, yes, these males are, again, incredibly weak, fragile insects.
Mhm.
So they're not great flyers. So it's not going to be like oriental fruit moth, where it's following a plume great distances. But because they're such weak flyers, they can be picked up by the wind
Mhm.
and they can be blown downwind. And then they get blown, an eighth of a mile, a quarter of a mile. And all of a sudden, oh, I'm landing on this vine and there's a pheromone trap next to me. And I will go in there.
Sure.
So,
Yeah, got it. Well, actually, why don't we take a few minutes here, if we could? Let's take a quick break. I'd like Janine to talk for a couple of minutes
Sure.
as a thank you to our sponsor. She's going to take a few moments with a small presentation that she has.
Sure. Get this going. So I wanted to share just some key ideas about adopting pheromone disruption for vine mealybug. And one of the really the key options in or the sorry, one of the optimal goals of a pheromone mating disruption program is long-term population decline, right? We see that in all pheromone programs, whether the Lepidopteran pest or the vine mealybug. And so, in order to do that, it's very crucial to have efficacious and consistent pheromone throughout the entire season. And so, with Isomate VMB twist ties, we have a pheromone dispenser that accommodates a variety of vineyard styles, whether it's head trained or trellised. And it's also the most secure dispenser on the market, right? So this dispenser will remain in the vineyard through mechanical harvesting. That's very crucial. We don't want that dispenser to end up in the fruit. We want it to stay into the vineyard. We want it to last through that fall flight, right? A lot of times growers don't want to be addressing vine mealybug post harvest. So having pheromone mating disruption through that October, November timing is critical. Isomate VMB has a longevity of 180 to 200 days, depending on the region. right? So it's a product that's registered in California and it's now registered in Oregon. So depending on the heat and the temperature of your climate is how long that pheromone dispenser will release. It also has a label rate of 120 to 200 dispensers per acre. So what that does is it allows growers to kind of choose the rate that best fits their vine mealybug pressure, but also fit their budget. So, right, it's really important to make sure that economics work. So, of course, in looking at the economics of the grape industry and where it's at right now, I wanted to compare a flowable pheromone formulation with a dispenser type formulation, right? It's really critical to get the most bang for your buck right now in these economics. So, when you look at 4 applications of a flowable pheromone formulation, you're looking at a grower cost about $84. And you're going to get about 120 days of pheromone coverage. Whereas if you did 150 dispensers of isomate at a similar cost of $85, you're going to get 200 days of pheromone release. So you're getting a little bit more bang for your buck, a little more stretch of your dollar, so to speak. Very important with economics. Another key component of when you're looking at a pheromone program is making sure that your pheromone is efficacious. In a side-by-side trial, isomate VMB provided 98.6% trap shutdown versus 78.6% trap shutdown of the competitor's pod dispenser, thus supporting that isomate has a consistent and efficacious release throughout the season. Yes, isomate VMB is available for organic use. We are certified through CCOF, we have OMRI listing, and we are certified for biodynamic farming. So kind of a neat, interesting avenue there. And if anybody has any further questions, please feel free to reach out to myself or my colleague, Joe DiVincenzi, who covers Central and Southern California, and we're always happy to share more.
Yeah, thank you so much. And
You're
thank you once
welcome.
again to Pacific Biocontrol for making today's event possible.
Yeah, thanks
Thank
for
you.
having me.
Of course. Right. Well, let's jump right back in. We were talking a little bit about some strategies of control, and while we're on the subject of mating disruption, we talked a little bit about some insecticides that we can use and the timing for that. What are some other methods of control? Give us some timings on that.
So timings on the insecticides or
Sure. Well,
we kind of
with
went through
respect
that a little.
to
Okay.
sure, with mating disruption,
Okay.
as well as use of parasites and things like that.
Okay,
What are
sure.
some other methods of control?
So I think that one of the aspects of mating disruption is that if you can put more pressure on the male population, then that always helps. So some of the contact materials we talked about for the mid-season control spray, like a sale, uh, can be pretty harsh on the male mealybug. So that's better because the idea of mating disruption is the males cannot locate the females to mate. And so the population is going to decrease because the female must mate. They're not able to put out a viable egg sac. Now, this is something we heard a lot in the very beginning with this program. There are some mealybugs that can produce viable egg sacs without mating. The vine mealybug is not one of them. Okay, but what will happen is that the female, mature female that's unmated, will start to produce eggs. They're not going to be viable eggs, but I've been in fields with mating disruption. I've stripped down the bark, and I've seen females with an ovisac. An ovisac is basically the waxy area carrying the eggs. And we've taken those eggs back, and we've found that nothing is hatched from those, okay, because she wasn't mated.
Mm.
And so you have to keep that in mind. There still can be mating happening with mating disruption because especially underneath the bark on the trunk, the if you've got a heavily if you want mating disruption to work, I'll take a step back. You've got to initially combine it with insecticides, right? You all seen pictures of vine mealybug nasty populations. And in that situation where you've got 1,000 mealybugs in a 4-inch section of the trunk, the male is going to emerge and it's not going to use the pheromone to find the female. It's just going to walk and find the female. So there will be some mating when the population's high. You combine it with an insecticide. There still will be some mating occurring in those patches underneath the bark on the trunk when you've got mealybugs in close proximity. So one of our problems with insecticides is I've mentioned all the most common insecticides. The problem is that the really good ones tend to be systemics, and they tend to go out towards the leaves. So you spray the material on, or you put the material in through the drip system, and the active ingredients tend to go out towards the leaves. And so I feel like we get very good control of mealybugs that are exposed, that are on the leaves. That's the same population that the parasites and the predators are very good at killing. The natural enemies are not, probably the best one would be the ladybird beetle, Cryptolaemus.
Mhm.
It can get underneath the bark as a larva, okay? But the parasite, Anagyrus pseudococcus or Anagyrus vladimiri, they're pretty much interchangeable. The parasite doesn't do well killing the mealybug underneath the bark on the trunk. Sometimes it can get down there, but not as good as the exposed mealybugs. We've looked at all kinds of surfactants trying to get that pesticide underneath the bark. And it's just been very difficult. One of the ones that we lost was chlorpyrifos, Lorsban, that was being used as a delayed dormant. And before it was lost completely, Lorsban had a fuming action. And so you'd spray it on, and it was like putting out a fumigant. And it would get underneath that bark area, and we had fantastic control. We lost that. That's when I started seeing populations build underneath the bark. You put on your good systemics, you're controlling the mealybug, knocking the population down, but it's still there and it's spreading. Goes to the next vineyard, goes to the next vine, still underneath the bark. So, and that's too where I think mating disruption, it 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 works, but if you have heavy populations underneath the bark, you're still going to have some mating. That's where maybe the flowable solution, because it's got so many more point sources, might be a little bit better. But again, it only lasts for about 30 days, 40 days, then you have to reapply it. It's a hard insect to kill. It's a
Yeah.
very hard. Organic growers have an even tougher time. So they're relying heavily on the natural enemy population. As mentioned, there's the parasite Anagyrus pseudococci. There's another one called Coccidoxinoides peregrinus. They don't have any common names. You have to think about it musically. So Coccidoxinoides peregrinus. If I see how it's spelled, I can't pronounce it at all. If I try to sing it, then I can pronounce it.
Yeah.
They're both here. We've got about 6 or 7 different species, but those two are by far the most common. Lots of predators. Green lacewings are terribly important. The beetle is far more common. The Cryptolaemus is far more common on the coast than it is in the Central Valley. Probably because of humidity. David Haviland pointed this out to me. I think he's right. In Italy, we see it far more commonly in northern Italy than we do in Sicily. Same thing. So,
Just to add to a little bit, we were talking about insecticide treatments and pheromones. I know when I'm visiting with growers, I try to discuss that kind of layered effect, right? And when you look at the chemistries that we have out there, the ones that are still effective, and you look at how much time you get with each chemistry, right? If you get 30 days with Movento or 30 days with your Admire, and then you look at how many total days there are out in a growing season, that's where that pheromone program fits in, right? You're filling in those gaps. So if you are using your chemistries, and a lot of people say, we're fine, we're getting by with what we're doing. Well, you kind of have open season for the rest of the year when your chemistries aren't out there, right? So that layered approach, adding that pheromone, and of course, Ken's exactly right, right? When you have a high population, you can layer it and you're using your chemistries to really kind of hammer down that population, it's going to take a few seasons to really see that difference. And anecdotally, when we talk to customers, they say that, like, the first year you put pheromone out, You might not see that much difference. Second year, there's improvement. But by that third year, you're really seeing that population tip in the direction you want it to go, right? Where you're not seeing it as much. So, again, that layered approach, using both tools, using your insecticides where you need to, and having that pheromone fill in those gaps and making sure, again, that it's lasting all the way through that fall flight because that is the critical party at the end of the year, right?
So we have to, I will say the same thing a little bit differently. So in the Central Valley, we'll focus on this area. We've got 7 to 8 generations of the mealybug each year. When you're, and this is why too, the different combinations of insecticides, the PCA and the vineyard manager and the vineyard owner really will know better about their situation than I will, because it could be a young vineyard. It could be a vineyard on drip irrigation versus flood irrigation. All these differences, vine physiology, when harvest time is going to happen, changes that combination that Janine was talking about of insecticides and the timing and the presence of that AI that's killing the mealybug. So when you've got 7 to 8 generations of mealybug, and you as you heard Kent talk, and Kent said, "Oh, typically we're putting Movento on May or June," and you're thinking, "Okay, May or June is when I should start thinking about the mealybug." Well, that mealybug is not thinking about you. That mealybug doesn't diapause. So if it's above 55 in January, it's developing,
Hmm.
and you're going to have 2 generations per year underneath the bark on the trunk between January and April. So when you're not thinking about the mealybug, it's thinking, and it's building up a population underneath that. And your application of different insecticides, 30 to 60 days is typically what we're going to get, and then it's going to wear off. That's why I think, in part, when we started this work, and we were monitoring with pheromone traps, we were having June and July counts in the hundreds. That was before Movento was there. That was before everyone was using neonics at bloom time. Now, part of why I think we're seeing fewer mealybugs on the leaves is because everyone's using these combinations, Movento, neonics. It's all going to the leaves. And the mealybug's biology has changed a little bit, staying more larger populations underneath the bark. And when is Movento, when are the neonics starting to really run out on the vine? It's 60 to 90 days maximum after application. So around September, we probably don't have enough Movento on that vine to kill it, unless you're doing a combination of 6 and 6, early and late, something like that. I still like the 8 ounces early in the season rather than splitting it. But again, PCAs and vineyard managers know better about that situation for that grower than I do, because everything changes with vine physiology, cultivar, region, the whole thing.
Sure, and we're talking about, this is we're talking about a national audience here, so there's going to be all kinds of variance in
Mhm.
coastal climate versus Central
Yeah.
Valley. Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I was going to ask you about that. Could you elaborate a little bit more on a change in biology? Because that's something I was thinking about while you were talking about how we were effectively controlling the vine mealybugs that are reaching out on the leaves,
Yeah.
right? Are we pushing them under the bark by controlling them so aggressively elsewhere?
So there might be 2 different ways of looking at this. The first way we'll say we're not changing their biology; it's the same insect, but as I mentioned before, it's spreading in the vineyard, and our materials are killing it on the leaves. There's never been. I've always emphasized that people used to describe the mealybug moving from the roots to the trunk to the canes to the leaves to the fruit throughout the season.
Yeah.
It's not like you've got this population that's always on the move, and the entire population's going on vacation to go find the sugars, right? What's happening is that you've got a population on the roots in some areas. Napa, not so much. Bakersfield, yes, so much. Coachella, definitely. But let's say Fresno area, large population during the dormant period, underneath the bark on the trunk and at the soil line on the roots. That population is having its 2 generations before we're thinking about control. Population's increasing, and now it's going to start to follow the sugars because it's a phloem feeder. So as the vine's starting to leaf out, you've got better food sources out there on those new leaves. So a portion of that population before all of our controls would go out there onto the leaves. And in the past, they would find better food source. They could get larger. The larger female has more eggs. Population develops faster with a better food source. If you give a vine more nitrogen, it develops faster. The females get larger. They have more eggs. You got more of a problem. We did that work decades ago. So what happens is that goes out to the leaves, no chemicals, builds up huge populations. That's what we used to see, and then it floods the grape clusters. Okay, so now we've got decades of putting good products out there on the leaves, and so the population, maybe it hasn't changed, maybe it's going out there, but maybe if there's a little bit of resistance or something developing, and it goes out and it feeds, if that dies, there's still a population left below, or maybe with some insects, some of these products, like the neonics, are anti-feeding. Glassy wing sharpshooter feeds a little bit on this part of the vine, doesn't like it, goes someplace else. Maybe our mealybugs are doing that same thing.
Mhm.
So,
Well, one of the right along that vein, one of the audience questions that we just got a moment ago, what are some of the first visual signs that a vine has infestation of vine mealybug?
again, I like the use of pheromone traps,
Mhm.
but ants are a great first sign. They're very visible, especially the Argentine ant, which is more coastal. We've got mostly the native gray ant. We've got a pavement ant in Lodi, which is becoming very common. But you can see these. You can see them going up and down the trunk. If you follow them, you usually will find mealybugs or some other phloem feeding insect. So that's a good sign.
So I just want to clarify: if you see ants, you have vine mealybug. Is that what you're saying?
Um, Typically,
Okay.
because we don't get the fire ant as much in vineyard. So yeah, typically you see ants in a vineyard, follow them, you're likely to find a mealybug.
Okay.
Okay. Um, Leaves showing a little bit of honeydew, trunk looking a little bit wet, but those are usually signs when you've got a pretty high population. For the trunk to be wet, there's hundreds of mealybugs underneath that bark. Um, Drop leaves. Um, you can have a population on the basal leaves early in the season, causing that leaf to start to senesce early in the year. So you're going down the rows and you're seeing yellowish leaves. Check that out. Maybe there's some mealybugs on that, or leaves on the ground at the base. Check that out. There might be some mealybugs there. And of course, leaf roll. If you've got leaf roll, and it's an older block, you probably have had some mealybugs in there for quite some time.
And that's because vine mealybug is if I understand correctly, the primary vector.
Any
Correct.
mealybug
Any mealybug
is a
okay.
vector.
Mhm.
So we've never found any fidelity of mealybugs with this pathogen. So the Gill's mealybug is now a known pistachio and almond pest. Was not even known to be in California 25 years ago. First found as a pest in olives, identified as a new insect. Moved on to grapes in the Sierra Foothill area. We tested it. Yes, it's a vector. So no history with vines at all, but put it on a vine with leaf roll, take it off that vine, put it on a clean vine, it can move the pathogen.
Mhm. Thank you. Thank you.
Sure.
Another question that we got from the audience. This one's for Janine.
Mm-hmm.
So, what was the process used to measure product duration? Main competitor claims the only way to measure pheromone release is through what they call gas chromatography. Forgive my pronunciation
No,
there.
it's a mouthful.
With flame ionization detection at every time point throughout the year.
Yes, so that is a key means for measuring the pheromone release or the pheromone what's remaining in that dispenser. And for us, I think there's really three ways to measure pheromone release. And one of the key ways, of course, is just putting it out into the vineyard and measuring trap shutdown, right? We want to make sure that the plume of that release of that dispenser is able to mask that trap, right? It's always been kind of an industry standard, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be injury reduction, but it's the first goal of any mating disruption dispenser. You want to have more pheromone than the lure. So having that out there. The second way is with a grass chromatograph. I can the mouth right.
Gas
We call it,
chromatography. Yeah.
GC analysis,
Uh-huh.
right? And so we do the same thing, and we do it every year, right? Where we watch the consistency of our dispensers. You pull them at regular intervals, you send them to a lab, and you look at the remaining amount of pheromone in that dispenser. And another way we do it is we do what is kind of a more simple, more immediate effect or a more immediate answer is to do gravimetric weights. So you have a set amount of dispensers, and then you bring them into your lab weekly, and you use a very scientific scale to measure those dispensers every week. And you can really graph and watch the release rate of that dispenser. And a dispenser should empty, right? It should go all the way to the end. You should see this gradual reduction, and it should empty. It shouldn't get to a certain point and stay at that weight, because then we kind of say that pheromone's locked up in that dispenser. So watching the gravimetrics of the dispensers, knowing that it's releasing completely, very, very important, and making sure that it's working as it should.
Yeah. Thank you.
One of the exciting things I want to mention right now is that we're in a period of time where Vine Mealybug, it's now a worldwide pest.
Hmm.
Europe, South America, Africa. And that's led to more industry attention, not just with insecticides, but with mating disruption. And there are new entities getting in the mating disruption field, looking at new ways of putting pheromone out. And I've worked with all of the different industries, and I've enjoyed working with each of the different companies. And I think for my point, the main thing is getting one of these products out there in the vineyard will be helpful. So
Anything, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's true, and the more that's out there, the better, right? When you look at the increase in area-wide programs in the different regions of California, right? Whether you're in Napa, whether you're in Clarksburg, whether you're down in San Luis Obispo, having more pheromone, whether it's the flowable, whether it's a dispenser type science, it benefits everyone.
And competition is good for the grower because there's that price drive.
Mhm.
Push it down too.
And
So
development,
win-win.
not to mention.
Yeah, and
Always,
development. Yeah.
Yeah, and I know when we were working in the field, we were out there brainstorming, right? Can we put dispensers on the ground? Can we make it a granule, right? And that's the brainchild of growth and development of these products. You look at, can an aerosol work out in a vineyard situation? And you don't know until you try it. And so that's always nice when you're collaborating and you're trying to determine, you know, how can we make this the best way for the growers and making it work for everyone.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. We do have a couple more questions from the audience, but before I let too much time go by, I would like to announce our winners for this morning. We have a couple. I want to first announce our $100 Amazon gift card winner, Donald Frederick, wine grape grower out of San Jose. Congratulations. You are the winner of the $100 Amazon gift card. And the winner of the Baco pruning tool set, forgive my pronunciation here again, Ron Aulak, raisin grape grower here in Madera, California. Congratulations, you are the winner of the Baco pruning tool set. Thank you once again to our sponsors for making that possible. Okay, now we have, like I said, we do have a couple more questions I want to make sure we cover before we run out of time here. One of the questions actually in advance of the event for Kent, do you recommend the use of Azagard for the control of mealybugs?
Sure. So we've worked with all the organic products. That's one of the OMRI certified materials. I believe a neem-based product. We tested soaps and oils, neem, diatomaceous earth, pyrethroids, or botanicals I mentioned, biologicals as well. A lot of this work was done with Luca Brilliante, a Fresno State faculty member, and others. We've been testing these products for a very long time. They are a knockdown material, and they have very low residual. So one of the aspects of that is that you have to apply them repeatedly throughout the season. It might be easier with something like the Grape Mealybug, which has got a generation that comes off in June, and you can target the crawlers. They work better against the smaller stages, so they won't do much against the adult female that's got all that white wax that just roll off her body. Um, so you have to know when the crawlers are coming out. We've had a hard time with these materials getting them underneath the bark because they're contact. They have to contact the early instar stages. So they do knock the population back. Um, uh, in our largest study, the one with Luca, we ended up having, in that particular situation, again, every vineyard can be different. In that particular vineyard, the control had a population that was similar to the organic products we tested. And that seemed to be, in that situation, because we had a huge population of green lacewings come in. We had a lot of mealybugs in the very beginning. So that natural enemy really focused in that control area. And a lot of these products are broad spectrum. And so they might have knocked that natural enemy population down a little bit. In the second generation, the second survey in that same blog, I will say that Azagard and a diatomaceous earth product had the lowest of the mealybug populations, but not significantly different from the others. But visually, you look at the graph, it was pretty low.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you. One other question that I wanted to pose actually to both of you, if I could, as we're getting ready to wrap up here. What is the ideal situation for control of vine mealybug? What does it look like when you come to a vineyard? And obviously, if vine mealybug didn't exist, that's the ideal, right? If it just suddenly disappeared. But what would you say? You said in the past we were looking at trying to get to, was it 2 to 3% control?
For moth pests.
For moth pests, that's right. That's right. Thank you. But for vine mealybug, what would you say walking through a vineyard is the ideal outlook? What is our goal here with control of vine mealybug?
Well, if you're a table grape grower, to keep it out of the clusters.
Okay.
If you're a wine grape grower, to control it as a vector of leaf roll, which has even less tolerance. I suggest for growers that if they're starting a new block, to start clean with material you know does not have vine mealybug or leaf roll or any other pathogens. And then to that young block, I would start with one of the neonicotinoids because it's going to be a new block, is going to be on a drip system. It's going to have a small root zone. So you protect it as it's developing. And then you might be able to pull back a little bit once that block is set, but you're monitoring with pheromone traps to see if the male mealybugs are anywhere nearby. And if you find it, then you're going in with one of the insecticide programs we talked about, or you're using mating disruption as a prophylactic to keep the population out. So population, if you start clean, will arrive. Mealybug coming in with a field crew, mealybug coming in on equipment, mealybug being blown in by the wind. But that single female second instar has not made it. And a male's got to find her to mate so that she can start a population. And so in the very beginning, if you can prevent mating as a prophylactic, you keep that population low. So that's best case scenario. That's not what I see. Typically, what I see is a grower that's got a pest problem. And they call me out there, and you strip bark, and they take you to the worst part of the block because they know, because they've been out there, and the PCA knows. And you go out there and you see, oh yeah, they've stripped that bark, they stripped that bark, here's ants, let's look. You've got a lot of mealybugs. And it's July. And I'll tell them, same thing we went through. You can consider some of the post-harvests, but next year you're going to have to get on top of this. You're going to have to use more than one application of more than one mode of action insecticide, knock that population back, then start considering mating disruption. First year, it's not going to have as much of an impact as it does second and third and fourth year. Try to drive that population down. If you are worrying about leaf roll and vitivirus, the 20% rule is usually thrown in out there, that if you have more than 20%, you're really not going to control it. It's going to continue to spread. And so you just farm it until it's not economical. So,
Thank you.
So since you asked about, my ideal, right? The ideal situation, I would say prevention, 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 right? That ideally, if a grower was going in with a new vineyard, right, you would be adding pheromone right away to prevent anything that might come in. If you have a vineyard that you don't feel has Vine Mealybug yet, but you know it's in the area, incorporating pheromone to prevent. That, to me, that's the ideal scenario. You can go at an economic rate and keep it that way. We certainly know that trying to get out of a crisis is a lot harder, but typically that's what we see when growers adopt pheromone, right? They're kind of in crisis, they're more reactive versus preventative. And so I would just encourage growers to really look at that preventative model and see the benefits of that. But like Ken said, it's more often it's the other way around.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, we have to be reactive sometimes.
Yep.
You know,
Absolutely.
if you have one question from the audience that I want to get to before we wrap up here, if you have low populations and use reduced rates of pheromone dispensers, aren't you running the risk of missing localized populations or hotspots, allowing populations to increase and therefore adversely affecting your overall mating disruption ROI? Any
so,
comment on that?
so my comment on that would be, I'm going to put mating disruption in contrast with insecticides, with the idea that you've got a low population, so I'm going to go in there with a really low dose of insecticide. And the background history on that is that's probably a way to develop insecticide resistance. You don't want to do that. You want to put in your normal insecticide dose, kill everything, kill as much as you can, so there's not a population there that's going to develop resistance. You can't get resistance. We don't think of resistance developing with pheromones. Okay, so I have seen pheromone application lower than label rates. You're going off label rate if you do that. But I have seen application of lower rates shut traps down. So you might be having an impact using that at a lower rate as a prophylactic. But again, you're going off label. And so you wanted to have the backup of the company itself. We should ask the company itself.
Sure. Yeah.
I think what's most important, and especially with this patch, because it's so patchy, right? Having enough point sources of pheromone is very critical, and having an even amount of point sources throughout that vineyard, and maybe having more on an upwind edge, really helps to keep that plume consistent. So I think knowing that lower rate, right? And this is why we did 2 years of study of a dose response trial to see where at that point pheromone wasn't enough to create trap shutdown, right? Knowing those rates. But again, point sources are very, very critical. If you only have a few over here, I've had growers that say, "Oh, I've got a hot spot over there. What if I just put pheromone there?" Well, you're like, "Well, yeah, that's your hot spot. Well, what about the rest of the spots? Because if you've got it there, it's likely throughout the entire vineyard." So keeping that even grid pattern, and I always encourage a little extra on those upwind edges to make sure that that plume is covering the ground as it should.
Yeah.
It's like when I'm asked, how many parasites should I release? How many cryptolamus should I release? And it's not being flippant, but the answer is as many as you can afford. Because when we did our studies, we were releasing at rates that no grower could afford. We were just trying to see, is it possible that releasing these parasites will lower the mealybug? Yes, but we were releasing at 5,000 parasites per acre, and growers just can't afford that for the most part.
Mhm.
So the
But
same thing with insecticides and pheromone. It's, more is better.
yeah, but if we're going to cut corners, maybe not on vine mealybug control, right? If at all possible, right? Okay.
Yeah, they don't care about the economics.
Yeah.
They're gonna keep on thriving.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your time this morning. Thank you for joining us. I think if you have, do you have any other further comments before we wrap up here? Anything else
Oh, it's
you want
been
to
a
share?
great conversation. Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Of course. And thank you so much as well to our audience this morning for joining us. This has been another great American Vineyard Live. Have a wonderful, wonderful weekend. Thank you.